Hey, it's Dr. Mitch. Let's start the cocaine lecture. I'm going to definitely keep this to under an hour. We're just going to be really focused. We'll just have this one lecture. It should be fine. Going to get into history, basically going back to ancient times, but also the big work in the 1800s when we started isolating cocaine hydrochloride, the mechanisms of action. In particular, we're going to talk about reuptake inhibitors. This is going to be important later when we're talking about some of the psychiatric meds, um, but primarily dopamine, and then we're going to talk about the other catecholamines as well. Get into some of the acute effects, but as you would guess from a major stimulant, they're a lot like a stimulant. The chronic effects tend to be not particularly good, and we'll detail all of those. Talk about forms of administration. There's chewing leaves, there's insufflation, stuff getting it up your nose, injectable. We'll get into it all. I'm not saying you should go home and make crack, but we just want to talk about crack formulation, if nothing else, to understand sort of how that works. And some policy issues, particularly some related to the disparity in sentencing between having, say, 5 grams of crack versus 5 grams of intranasal cocaine, and then talk about the treatment approaches, although I gotta admit they're not very optimistic. But while we're getting into it, let's ask a few questions about caffeine from the previous lecture. So if you had to guess the neurotransmitter system most relevant, um, is it A, adenosine, B, GABA, or C, acetylcholine? And I certainly hope you picked adenosine. Obviously, it's an adenosine blocker. That's the thing that kind of makes it novel and interesting. So do understand that distinction. It's not that caffeine stimulates so much as it makes you unable to detect your own fatigue. Oh, and this is an intriguing one too. So which of these would have more caffeine? Is it A, 10 ounces of coffee, B, 10 ounces of black tea, or C, 10 ounces of chocolate? And again, I do hope you picked coffee. Obviously, black tea is different methylxanthine, same for the chocolate bar. We'll probably get into that in the next question. Yes, and nothing if not predictable. So which of these has the most theophylline? Is it 10 ounces of coffee, 10 ounces of black tea, or 10 ounces of chocolate bar? I do hope you picked the black tea. And in fact, the chocolate bar would have theobromine, as we've discussed. All right, well, let's transition a bit into the highlights from the history of cocaine. So I realize the book goes back to 1200s. I mean, truth be told, that's when folks started coming over here. I'm sure coca leaves have been around forever. Obviously, in the Peruvian, Bolivian, in the Andes Mountains there, this was big. Folks could, put a wad of those with a bit of lime in their mouth and be able to work longer and harder up in the mountains where the air is thin, and this practice is still pretty prevalent today. A friend of mine just came back from Brazil saying it was kind of all over the place. The subjective effects are probably a lot like a couple of lattes. I don't see folks getting all strung out on it in the same way we have problems with powder cocaine or crack here in the US, so maybe that would be the way to have it be legal. And then in 1859, Alfred Neiman isolated cocaine from that coca leaves. You got native people working fine with a plant, and then Caucasians get in there and say, better, stronger, faster, no, what's the thing? So once we had the cocaine hydrochloride, everybody kind of went nuts with it and really thought it was this panacea. So Angelo Mariani basically marketed the Vin Mariani. It was this, from what I hear, pretty shitty Italian red wine and cocaine mixed in there, and what a surprise. That was certainly a popular drink. Cocaine and alcohol put together create this new molecule, cocaethylene, that we'll talk about a little later, but it's alcohol slows the metabolism of just about everything, including cannabis, and this made the cocaine effects perhaps a little blunted, but certainly last longer. Mark Twain sent a bottle to Ulysses S. Grant when he was writing his memoirs. It was pretty rampant, and obviously we didn't have through Food and Drug Act, we didn't have anything inhibiting its sales, so it was pretty much all over the place. Mid 1880s, Freud writes this paper called On Coca, and basically just makes cocaine sound like it's the bomb, and claimed he cured his friend Fleece of morphine addiction with it. Fortunately, old Fleece was then all strung out on cocaine, so really the full one drug for another's thing may not be as effective as folks might have hoped. Oh, there's this amazing letter where he's writing to his girlfriend, and it's kind of like basically all the stuff he's going to do to her after a couple of hits of cocaine. I'll spare you the thought of Freud and his girlfriend. So in 1903, the Coca-Cola company removed cocaine from its formulation. This is an intriguing story as well. So Pemberton, the guy who started the cocaine, basically took the cola nut, which is really high in caffeine, and cocaine, and used that to formulate Coca-Cola. It was known as the pause that refreshes, as I imagine it would have been. It wasn't like there was a ton in there, but definitely enough to create some subjective effects. Now they still use decoconized, basically coca leaves with the cocaine taken out. There's one company in the US that can take the cocaine out of the leaves and send it out basically for eye surgery and medicinal use. And that's part of why powder cocaine is Schedule 2, even though cannabis is Schedule 1. And then they use the leaves and send them to the Coca-Cola company. So it must be a pretty lucrative business. In 1914, the Harrison Act we talked about with the opiates, but it also prohibited cocaine and essentially was tightening up access over the years so that folks couldn't have cocaine as readily available. This is post-Pure Food and Drug Act. So it was intriguing to get Congress to pass this. A lot of muckraking, some bad newspapers. Nobody really validated the way they do now. We never have fake news now. But a lot of this was related to the myth of the cocaine fiend, and this was almost always a man of color using cocaine who suddenly would have superhuman strength and was invulnerable to bullets and attractive to white women, and just all this really ridiculous propaganda. And obviously, if cocaine did that, we'd be using it in the military. But the thing that it kind of tapped into some racist attitudes in order to get passed is kind of a heartbreaking part of a series of laws here in the United States. 1980s, folks basically figured out how to make crack cocaine. We'll get into that later in this lecture, but the abuse was really rampant. Also, the media coverage was insane. Literally every news magazine had a crack baby story or something about crack on the cover all the time. And then you can imagine all the weird conspiracy theories about, the government giving it to folks in the inner city. And essentially you had a rapid onset version of cocaine that was smokable. So you're going to get really quick up, really quick down, and then the markedly more demand for the use. And then, unfortunately, the reaction was, of course, to make crack cocaine gram per gram much more likely to get you a really punitive sentence if you were caught with it. And so that was rationalized as if it weren't a racist thing, suggesting that, as if folks were using intranasal cocaine for medicinal purposes or something like it. I never really understood that. It wasn't until 2010 got Obama to reduce this from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. So you still get 18 times the sentence for a gram of crack as you would for a gram of intranasal cocaine. But it's better than 100 to 1. We tried to appeal to Clinton on this. The drug laws just are never going to be what they ought to be. So with that in mind, I just wanted you to see what the leaves look like, and it's really innocuous. It's not that much different from the pictures of the tea leaves, as you can imagine, and if you saw this growing in my backyard, you probably wouldn't think much of it, although it'd be pretty hard to grow in my backyard because it's just too cold up here. That's why we see it grown in, Bolivia, basically South and Central America. It's got to be really hot and really wet to make this plant really thrive. And then this is what the leaves look like. They're also pretty innocuous looking, and apparently Mambe might be the term you use if it's shredded or powdered or something like that. It's often for sale in Brazil, a few other countries. Or folks just sell the leaves like this, and it's relatively inexpensive. And as I was saying, the impact is not particularly more dramatic than some of the caffeine we're all probably using right now. So the medicinal uses went wild, and these were, basically patent meds. And here's one for sore throats. It's got diamorphine and cocaine in it. Obviously, that would have made your throat feel markedly better. The fact that they wrote poison on it kind of blows my mind. But it looks like they're some fraction of a gram of each in each one, so it wasn't necessarily a particularly high dose, but that local anesthetic effect was bound to kick in, and obviously morphine is quite the anesthetic. I'm sure these made your throat feel good until you ran out, and then you probably wanted another one pretty quickly. And then this is a pretty famous advertisement. So it's from 1885, the cocaine toothache drops. The fact they got little kids on there, it's kind of heartbreaking, but there's another ad for a teething syrup that had both cocaine and morphine in it. Nobody knew any better, so obviously this was for sale from Lloyd Manufacturing right here in Albany. And I'm sure folks used this, and it was, as good a local anesthetic as anything else we had at the time. But if you gave them to your kids a little late in the day, I bet they didn't sleep too well. Yes, and here's Pemberton's little advertisement for his syrup. So basically, the pharmacist would buy this, and they'd have the seltzer water behind the counter there, and you'd come in and say, "Give me a shot," and they would, put a little syrup in with the soda, and you could choke it down. And they thought it was a nerve tonic. So again, it's the coca plant and the cola nut. A delicious, exhilarating, refreshing, and invigorating beverage. I'm sure it was. A valuable brain tonic and a cure for all nervous afflictions. Well, obviously, we didn't have the truth in advertising laws then we have now. So good for sick headache, neuralgia, hysteria, melancholy, and what ails you. I gotta admit, it probably wasn't that much worse than a big cup of coffee when I look back, just given the concentrations. It's not like they had a gram in every glass or anything like that. And yeah, Pemberton sold this, and basically Coca-Cola and Pepsi have been sort of competing ever since. So oddly enough, despite Freud by the late 1800s saying, hey, cocaine is a problem, we shouldn't do this, it's like humans forget every century or so. And so by the 1970s, cocaine was all trendy and hip again, and had these ridiculous, fancy schmancy paraphernalia things. They used to have these gold razor blades, these ridiculous silver spoons folks wore around their necks back then, and it was markedly more expensive than it was now. So to pay $100, $150 a gram, and back then that was a lot of money. Minimum wage was $3.35, so you can imagine what that meant to somebody. And folks seem to just have forgotten about the negative consequences from the century before. Every generation's got to learn this lesson on their own, I guess. So let's get into the mechanisms of action here. More than anything, I want to emphasize that when I was in undergrad, it was all about the dopamine, and it basically seemed to be that cocaine was just this dopamine reuptake inhibitor. And in fact, it looks like all the catecholamines, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, they all have this similar part of a molecule. and they all block reuptake. So what's really going on is that presynaptic neuron is going to let go of the neurotransmitter into the synapse, and then the presynaptic neuron has a mechanism for pulling that neurotransmitter back in and recycling it. Basically, those are hard to make, and you don't want to waste them. In fact, what the reuptake inhibitor does is sort of block that part of the nerve that makes the reuptake happen. And so now essentially it ends up out in the synapse longer so that postsynaptic neuron can fire more times. That's pretty much what's going on, but the fact that it's going on with all three of these neurotransmitters seems to be fairly novel. And in fact, pharmacological treatments for cocaine problems don't seem to work well, even if they are reuptake inhibitors for any one of these. It's a complicated drug, and the more we learn about it, the more we realize, yeesh, this is not a toy. Emphasizing just modes of administration here. Obviously, the leaves are just chewed, and cocaine's going to be absorbed through any mucous membrane. I mean, any mucous membrane too, so use your imagination. But the insufflation, so the snorting up the nose, obviously that blood is really close to your frontal cortex. It's going to have a pretty rapid onset. Injection, smoked forms are really just crack and freebase. Freebase was essentially dissolving it in a solvent, often than lighting it on fire, but really, really dangerous. So this often involved ether, which is highly flammable. You might know about poor Richard Pryor's problem with some of this. And then injected solutions, depending on how long your arm is, it's like about 14 seconds before you get that initial rush. Obviously, the faster modes of administration also have higher addictive propensity. So this is going to be, other than chewing the leaves, not a drug you really want to mess with. Oh, good. So here's a better image for illustrating reuptake inhibition. So this is for the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the alleged antidepressants, if you will. And we'll talk about these more when we get into the psychiatric meds. But what's really going on? Okay, so you see these gray circles that have the little black dots inside. That's just a vesicle that contains that neurotransmitter. It's going to make its way to the membrane on this presynaptic neuron and let that neurotransmitter into the synapse. In this case, it's serotonin, but for cocaine, literally all the catecholamines are blocked this way. And then you see these gray kind of oddball circles with the little oval around them. This is the reuptake inhibitor. So it's going to block basically the part of the neuron that would generally get it to go ahead and bring that neurotransmitter back inside. So the postsynaptic nerve is going to end up firing markedly more times because that neurotransmitter is literally hanging out in the synapse. All right, well, let's get into some of the acute effects of cocaine. Far and away, one of the biggest issues medicinally is that it's a local anesthetic. So you see folks rubbing it on their gums or saying their nose is numb. That's literally a local effect. There's also that vasoconstriction. So if you are going to use it in surgery, it's going to be locally anesthetizing, but also decreasing blood flow there. So for an eye surgery, the eye's really vascularized, as you've probably seen if you've ever had red eyes. So here's a chance to basically kill two birds with one stone, try to keep the bleeding down and make sure that that's anesthetized. And this was really common in the late 1800s. Freud was saying that surgeons ought to do a little snort and then use it right there on the person they're doing the surgery on, which must have been nuts. This general sense of well-being. So the surveys that are designed to assess subjective effects of drugs, it looks like compared to the minor stimulants and even amphetamine, there's this kind of narcissistic, self-inflated perception. So folks on cocaine jags are, getting these great ideas for a novel, and I'm going to write it all in the next couple of weeks. And right after I do the 9-day bike race across the United States, and then I'm going to start a business. It's, like the worst of the hypomanic or manic episodes in folks with bipolar disorder. Aphrodisiac properties disputed. So allegedly, it was going to be this magical turn you on sexually kind of drug. I mean, most guys in their 20s, any stimulant is basically something they consider an aphrodisiac. But truth be told, just increased general arousal is sometimes mistaken for sexual arousal if the cues are all there, and it doesn't seem to really have much impact on performance, shall we say. So much like Shakespeare said of alcohol, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So you definitely see with the major stimulants a lot of erectile dysfunction, ejaculatory incompetence, which makes for a really long night, and just, not going to be much of an aphrodisiac really at all, despite the reputation. Appetite suppressed, so yeah, obviously like the other stimulants, but there's this astounding rebound later. So once it wears off, folks are super hungry and often end up binging. Pupils are dilated, as we saw with a lot of the stimulants, and just know that as a nice hallmark sign. And then I do want to emphasize that acutely they're definitely toxic doses. So you're going to see cardiac arrest and respiratory arrest, so heart rate going really fast and breathing really fast. If there are any anomalies biologically already, you're going to be at risk. And truth be told, if the dose is high enough, it can kill anybody. So I definitely see ERs with folks in there with, ridiculous tachycardia, and you got to intervene early. And this idea that, oh, I'll just take a Xanax or I'll just drink this beer is not a good idea. Alcohol increases heart rate too. So you really, this drug's nasty. I'm not sure what else to say. All right, well, so we're a little over 20 minutes, but go ahead and write yourself a few sample questions and watch a little comedy, dance around, do what you need, and we'll pick it up on cocaine 2.